There's a strange moment that comes after an awakening. You wake up one day and realize the things you once loved, the hobbies, the passions, the activities that filled your weekends, suddenly feel empty. The video games you used to play for hours just feel repetitive. The art you once poured your soul into feels like a chore. Even the social circles built around those hobbies begin to feel distant, almost irrelevant. At first, it's confusing and a little unsettling. You wonder if you're depressed, burned out, or just not yourself anymore. But the truth is far more profound. Carl Jung, one of the most influential psychologists of the 20th century, would say this isn't a random loss of interest, it's the psyche reorganizing itself. It's not depression so much as transformation. What's really happening is that the energy that once fueled your old interests is being redirected toward something deeper, something closer to your authentic self. Jung called this process individuation, the lifelong journey of becoming who you truly are. So in this video, I'm going to explore why awakening so often comes with this sudden loss of interest in our old hobbies. I'll be using Jung's psychology as a guide to show how this isn't something wrong with us, it's actually a natural part of the shift toward greater meaning. Losing interest doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're evolving. The nature of awakening. Awakening is a word that gets thrown around a lot, and it can mean different things depending on context. For some, it's a spiritual event, a moment when the veil of ordinary life lifts and you see the world with new eyes. For others, it's more psychological, the sudden realization that the life you've been living isn't truly yours. Both perspectives overlap in Jung's work, because he saw awakening as a deep shift in consciousness, something that shatters the old identity and forces you to confront reality at a new depth. Jung described the ego as the center of consciousness, but not the center of the whole psyche. Beyond the ego is the self, a larger organizing principle that includes the unconscious. Awakening often begins when the self pushes against the ego, demanding that you recognize the deeper dimensions of who you are. This can be experienced as unsettling dreams, existential crises, or a sudden loss of meaning in things that once seemed important. In this sense, awakening is not a gentle addition to life, it's disruptive. It destabilizes the structures we relied on for comfort, our routines, our hobbies, even our relationships. That disruption is necessary because it forces us to question the masks we've been wearing and the distractions we've been using. Awakening strips away illusions so that something more authentic can come forward. Hobbies before awakening. Before awakening, hobbies serve many roles. On the surface, they're just fun, they give us joy, entertainment, and a sense of identity. But Jung would say hobbies are rarely just hobbies. They often express aspects of the persona, the social mask we create to interact with the world. For example, being a gamer, a musician, or a sports fan isn't only about the activity itself, it's also about who you are in relation to others. Hobbies can become part of the story you tell about yourself. On a deeper level, hobbies can also function as compensations. If your life feels stressful or unfulfilled, a hobby can provide relief and escape. This isn't inherently bad, it can even be healthy, but it means that hobbies often carry unconscious weight. Jung emphasized that what we avoid or repress in daily life tends to come out sideways, sometimes in the form of compulsive hobbies or obsessions. In that sense, our old passions may have been serving the ego more than the self. Looking back, many of the things I once called hobbies were actually ways of filling a void. They were tools for managing anxiety, boredom, or the nagging sense that something was missing. After awakening, though, those old activities lost their power. They no longer distracted me the way they used to. And that's where the loss of interest began to make sense. It wasn't that I had lost passion, it was that the unconscious contract behind the hobby had expired. Loss of interest, a reallocation of libido. Jung's concept of libido is essential here. Unlike Freud, who tied libido mostly to sexual energy, Jung defined it more broadly as the psychic energy that fuels all of life, our desires, our creativity, our ambitions, and yes, our hobbies. Where our libido flows, our interests come alive. When our libido withdraws, activities that once felt exciting suddenly feel flat. After awakening, libido often pulls back from its old investments. The activities that once absorbed us, video games, collecting, binge-watching, even certain friendships, begin to feel empty. This isn't laziness, it's a reallocation of energy. The psyche is no longer willing to spend life force on pursuits that don't align with deeper growth. Jung compared this to a river changing course. The flow of water doesn't disappear, it simply carves a new path. For me, this explained why the loss of interest felt so total. It wasn't just that I had grown tired of one or two hobbies, it was as if the very spark that animated those activities had drained away. Jung would say this is the psyche preparing for a new orientation. The libido is being redirected toward inner work, dreams, symbols, questions of meaning that demand attention during awakening. What feels like losing interest is actually the psyche pulling you into a new, uncharted territory. Confrontation with meaninglessness. One of the hardest parts of awakening is the confrontation with meaninglessness. Jung noted that when the old values collapse, people often enter a stage of profound emptiness. The hobbies and routines that once provided stability now feel trivial. This emptiness is painful, but it's also necessary because it forces you to ask deeper questions. What really matters? Who am I beyond my roles and distractions? The hobbies I once loved suddenly looked like props on a stage that no longer interested me. They had served their purpose, but awakening exposed them as temporary. Jung compared this to the midlife crisis, where people realize the achievements and pleasures of youth no longer sustain them. It's not about age, it's about the psyche demanding a new orientation toward meaning. This stage can feel bleak, but Jung warned against trying to rush past it. If we force ourselves back into old hobbies just to avoid the void, we miss the chance to discover what the psyche is pointing us toward. Meaninglessness, in Jung's view, is the doorway to transformation. It strips us bare so that authentic meaning can finally take root. The role of shadow and persona. Another reason hobbies lose their appeal is that awakening brings the shadow to the surface. The shadow is everything we've repressed or denied about ourselves. Before awakening, hobbies can serve as convenient ways to avoid confronting the shadow. They provide escape, distraction, and sometimes even overcompensation. For example, someone insecure about their identity might bury themselves in a hobby that gives them a sense of belonging or superiority. Awakening disrupts this dynamic by forcing the shadow into consciousness. Once you start facing your fears, insecurities, and repressed desires, the hobbies that once helped you avoid them no longer feel satisfying. They don't work as distractions anymore. Instead, they may even highlight how much avoidance was hiding underneath. The persona also comes into play. Many hobbies are tied to identity markers, being the artist, the gamer, or the athlete. When awakening begins dismantling the persona, these roles lose their grip. Jung insisted that awakening involves loosening our attachment to the persona so we can encounter the deeper self. Losing interest in persona-based hobbies is simply part of this process. Individuation and transformation. At the heart of Jung's psychology is individuation, the process of becoming whole. Awakening is a call toward individuation, and losing interest in hobbies is one of its symptoms. Old activities that were tied to the ego fall away, making space for new ways of living that align with the self. This can feel like death, because parts of the old identity really are dying. But it's also birth, the beginning of something new. Jung described individuation as a dialogue between the conscious and unconscious. When hobbies no longer serve this dialogue, they wither. But when new activities emerge that express deeper truths, they flourish. For example, you might lose interest in competitive hobbies but gain interest in creative or spiritual ones. The loss isn't a void forever, it's a transition. Transformation requires sacrifice, and hobbies are often among the first things sacrificed. The psyche is selective about where energy goes, and individuation demands a higher allocation toward inner work. Old hobbies don't vanish because they're worthless, they vanish because something more meaningful is asking to be born. Emptiness as a stage. It's important to recognize that the emptiness after losing hobbies isn't permanent. Jung spoke often about the nigredo stage, drawn from alchemy, where everything feels dark and lifeless. This stage is part of the transformation process. Losing interest in hobbies is just one expression of nigredo, a necessary decomposition before renewal. During this stage, it's easy to panic. You may think, I've lost my passions, I've lost myself. But Jung would say the opposite is true, you're actually moving closer to yourself. The emptiness is the psyche's way of clearing space. Without this clearing, the new couldn't arrive. Eventually, the libido returns, but it returns in new directions. Interest may resurface in activities that feel authentic and alive, often with more depth than before. The emptiness is a bridge, not a destination. Integration and reorientation. After the void, new forms of interest often appear. Jung emphasized creativity, spirituality, and service as natural expressions of the individuated self. These new pursuits aren't just hobbies, they feel like extensions of one's deeper being. Painting becomes less about skill and more about expression. Reading becomes less about distraction and more about discovery. Even old hobbies can return, but with a transformed purpose. For example, I once played music just to impress people or pass the time. After awakening, the same instrument felt different, it became a way to connect with something transcendent. Jung would say the activity was rerouted in the self rather than the ego. The hobby wasn't lost, it was reborn. Integration means recognizing that hobbies aren't the problem. It's the meaning we attach to them. When our meaning shifts, our interests naturally shift. Awakening doesn't end hobbies, it reorients them. Conclusion. So why do we lose interest in hobbies after awakening? Because awakening redirects the psyche's energy. Old activities tied to the persona, the shadow, or simple distraction no longer satisfy. The libido pulls back, emptiness takes over, and we're left questioning everything. But this isn't a dead end, it's a transformation. Jung's psychology helps us see this clearly. Losing interest isn't laziness or failure, it's the self calling us forward. The emptiness is part of individuation, part of the alchemical process of breaking down the old so the new can emerge. Hobbies may return, but in a different form, one aligned with deeper meaning. If you've lost interest in your hobbies after awakening, it doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're evolving. And as Jung would remind us, the goal of life isn't to cling to the old, but to allow the self to guide us toward wholeness. The loss is real, but so is the rebirth waiting on the other side.